He came to the forest in the middle of summer with nothing to prove and nowhere left to run. A broken veteran, a retired K-9 who never truly stopped serving. What was meant to be a quiet walk turned into something no one could have planned. A forgotten place, a life hanging by seconds, and a choice that would pull him back from the edge when he thought there was nothing left to save. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Seattle in late July didn't feel like the postcard version people sold to tourists. The sky was a washed-out blue with a hard, white sun that seemed too close, and the air sat heavy over the city like a lid. Heat bounced off glass towers and long ribbons of asphalt, turning intersections into shimmering mirrors. Even the breeze coming off Elliott Bay carried warmth, as if the water had been holding its breath for days. In the neighborhoods east of downtown, lawns crisped at the edges, and maple leaves curled slightly, tired and dusty. The news kept repeating the same words: unseasonable heat, dry conditions, elevated fire risk. And every time Ethan Cole heard them, it felt less like a forecast and more like a warning meant for someone else. Ethan sat in the driver's seat of a dark, older model SUV parked beneath the thin shade of a street tree that didn't quite reach the hood. He was 42, tall in a way that made small spaces feel tighter, shoulders squared from years of carrying weight that wasn't always physical. His hair, once kept close and neat, had grown out unevenly, dark brown, shot through with early gray at the temples. A short beard covered the angles of his jaw, trimmed more out of habit than vanity, shadowing a mouth that rarely remembered how to relax. His eyes were a hazel green that people sometimes called kind, but lately they held the flat focus of a man who had learned to watch the world without stepping into it. He moved carefully, as if any sudden motion might knock loose something inside him that had been pinned down by routine. On the passenger side floor lay a folded map that Ethan had bought from a gas station, even though he didn't trust paper any more than he trusted screens. The corners were already soft from being handled, refolded, opened again. Beside it sat a small canvas bag packed with basics: water filter, lighter, a compact first aid kit, a headlamp, jerky, electrolyte packets. No camping stove, no tent. He had no interest in making this a vacation. The point, if he had to name it, was distance. A stretch of quiet, long enough to let the constant static in his head drop to a bearable hum. A soft thump against the console drew his gaze down. Rex was sitting behind the front seats, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of the dog through the air. Rex was a Belgian Malinois, 4.5 years old, built like a coiled spring, lean muscle under a short coat the color of sand and dark honey, with a black mask that made his amber eyes look sharper than they already were. His ears stood high and alert, not twitchy, just attentive in the way working dogs never quite unlearn. A faint scar ran along the edge of his right ear, an old injury from training days that had healed clean but left a permanent notch. Rex's expression wasn't anxious. It was watchful, steady, as if he had accepted that his job was to keep Ethan moving in the right direction, even when Ethan didn't know what the right direction was. "Not long," Ethan said, more to himself than to the dog. His voice was rougher than he remembered it being years ago, like he'd been speaking through smoke. Rex blinked once, slow, then lowered his head to rest it on his paws. He trusted Ethan the way Ethan didn't trust much of anything anymore. The last time Ethan had truly planned a trip, he'd done it with someone else. Lauren had loved lists and little laminated itineraries, loved making the world feel orderly enough to enjoy. She'd been the kind of woman whose calm wasn't fragile. It was practiced, built from small choices repeated every day. Medium height, warm brown skin that caught the sun easily, dark hair that she wore in a low braid when she was working and loose when she was happy. Her laugh had lifted at the end, like a question turning into an answer. Ethan used to joke that she could talk strangers into kindness. It hadn't been a joke, not really. She could. Then the illness came and changed the shape of their home. Not in a dramatic movie scene way, but slowly. Appointments, medication schedules, silent nights when the air in the hallway felt too loud. Ethan had learned to be efficient, to do what needed doing without letting emotion interfere. He was good at that. He'd been trained to be good at that. When Lauren died, it felt like someone had pulled a load-bearing wall out of the house and expected the roof to stay up. Mia's death had been worse because it was sudden. 9 years old, all sharp elbows and stubborn opinions, freckles across her nose like someone had scattered cinnamon there, hair always slightly messy as if it refused to obey. She had Ethan's eyes. That detail used to make him proud. Now it made mirrors feel like ambushes. The accident at the lake had lasted only minutes. The aftermath had lasted forever. Ethan's brain replayed it in fragments, sunlight on water, people shouting, the sickening pause before someone started running. There were days he woke up convinced he could still fix it if he moved fast enough. Rex had been the one constant through all of it. He had served with Ethan overseas, trained for detection and protection, then retrained, partly, for search and rescue support stateside. When Ethan left the service, Rex came with him, a retired K-9 who never fully retired. At night, Rex would settle near Ethan's bed, head toward the door, ears tuned to the smallest shift in the house. During the worst weeks after Mia, when Ethan forgot to eat, forgot to answer calls, forgot what day it was, Rex had shoved his nose into Ethan's hand until Ethan stood up and filled a bowl, first for the dog, then, by reflex, for himself. Now, in this overheated Seattle afternoon, Ethan stared at the road ahead as if it were a decision that could be undone. His phone buzzed once in the cup holder, then went quiet. He didn't pick it up. He already knew who it might be. His sister, checking in with her careful, worried tone, a former squad mate, offering a beer and a conversation they'd both pretend wasn't about grief, a neighbor reminding him that his grass was turning the color of straw. None of it felt urgent compared to the pressure inside his chest that grew worse the longer he stayed still. He started the engine. The SUV rumbled, old but willing. Rex rose smoothly, repositioning so he could look out the side window. As Ethan pulled away from the curb, the city slid past in bright, sharp-edged frames. Bus stops, coffee shops, people in shorts moving like they were surprised by the heat. He crossed the bridge east, leaving the taller buildings behind for lower neighborhoods and then highway. The air conditioner pushed out lukewarm air that smelled faintly of dust. Ethan didn't mind. Discomfort was familiar. It was quiet he was chasing. On Interstate 5, the landscape began to change. The city thinned. The horizon opened. Mountains waited in the distance like a darker idea. Ethan kept both hands on the wheel, knuckles pale, posture rigid. It wasn't fear of driving. It was fear of where his mind went when his body didn't have to do anything else. Rex watched him in the rearview mirror. Not staring, not needy. Just present. When Ethan's breathing started to shorten, Rex shifted forward and rested his chin lightly on the center console, close enough that Ethan could see the dog's whiskers, the tiny flecks of dust on his nose. The simple weight of that presence did what therapy sessions and polite conversations often couldn't. It anchored Ethan to the moment without asking him to explain anything. An hour later, Ethan exited onto a smaller road that angled toward thicker green. The heat softened under tree cover, traded for humidity and the smell of pine warmed by sun. The sign for the Olympic region appeared briefly, then vanished behind him. He followed directions from the map, then ignored them, when a narrow side road promised fewer cars and more silence. His choice wasn't reckless so much as tired. He wanted the world to stop demanding that he be understandable. He pulled into a gravel lot near the edge of a trailhead. A few other vehicles sat scattered under the trees, their windshields flashing in the sun. The trail sign warned about conditions: dry brush, sudden weather changes, stay on marked paths. Ethan read it, absorbed the words, and felt nothing. Warnings had always existed. They rarely stopped anything from happening. He shut off the engine. The quiet that followed was immediate, thick, broken only by insects and a distant bird call. Rex hopped down and stood beside him, tail neutral, ears forward. Ethan clipped the leash more out of habit than necessity. Rex could have walked off leash and stayed close. He was trained for that. But Ethan needed the ritual of control. It helped him believe the day wouldn't fracture into chaos. For a moment, Ethan looked back at the SUV as if considering turning around. Seattle would still be there. His empty house would still be there. The things he couldn't fix would still be waiting. He faced the trail instead. The forest ahead was sunlit, deceptively calm, the kind of summer green that made danger look impossible. Rex stepped forward first, steady and deliberate. Ethan followed, boots crunching lightly on gravel as they entered the shade. He told himself he was just going for a walk. Just a few hours. Just enough to breathe. He didn't know yet that the summer in these woods could turn, fast and violent, and that somewhere deeper in the trees, something old was still standing, waiting with the patience of wood and iron, waiting for a man who thought he had nothing left to carry. The forest swallowed sound the way water swallowed heat. Within minutes of leaving the gravel lot, the sharp glare of summer thinned into a green-filtered glow, sunlight breaking into fragments as it passed through overlapping crowns of fir and cedar. The air here felt heavier but cooler, damp enough that Ethan could taste soil and resin with every breath. Cicadas pulsed in irregular waves, and somewhere deeper in the woods, a woodpecker hammered with patient insistence. It was the kind of quiet that didn't ask questions. It simply existed. Ethan kept a steady pace, boots landing with deliberate care on the packed dirt of the main trail. He wasn't in a hurry. The discipline of movement, heel, toe, balance, gave his thoughts something to orbit around without collapsing inward. Rex walked ahead by a few feet, leash slack, body aligned with the path but senses clearly stretched beyond it. The dog's head dipped and lifted in a slow rhythm, nostrils flaring as he sampled the layered smells of summer, warm bark, crushed fern, the faint metallic tang of old water running over stone. Every so often, Rex glanced back, amber eyes checking Ethan's posture and breath the way medics once checked pulses. The trail sign from the parking area echoed in Ethan's mind. Dry conditions, sudden weather changes, but the forest didn't look dangerous. Leaves were full, the ground shaded and intact, birds busy with ordinary business. Danger, he had learned, rarely announced itself in advance. It arrived sideways, disguised as routine. After 20 minutes, the soundscape shifted. The steady insect hum softened, replaced by a low, constant rush. Water. Ethan followed the noise until the trail curved and revealed a narrow creek running fast over smooth stones, clear enough to see the pale shapes of pebbles rolling along its bed. Summer runoff, fed by snowmelt lingering high in the mountains, cold and deceptively strong. The trail crossed it by way of a simple wooden footbridge, planks sun-bleached and bowed slightly at the center. Rex paused before the bridge, ears forward, weight shifting. He sniffed the air, then the planks, claws clicking once as he tested the surface. Satisfied, he moved across with the easy confidence of an animal that trusted its own balance more than any structure. Ethan followed, hand brushing the rough railing. The water below moved faster than it looked, tugging at Ethan's eyes as if inviting a misstep. He didn't linger. On the far side, the trail narrowed. Ferns crowded in, their fronds brushing Ethan's legs with a soft, whispering touch. A mile marker appeared, half hidden behind moss, its numbers faded. Ethan slowed, checking the map. According to paper, he was still on a maintained route. According to instinct, something had already shifted. The forest felt thicker, older, as if it had decided not to bother performing for visitors anymore. They passed another hiker not long after, a man in his late 20s, lean and sunburned, wearing a tank top and carrying a pack that looked too light for anything but a day stroll. His beard was patchy, more fashion than necessity, and his smile was quick, unburdened. He nodded at Ethan and Rex. "Hot one," he said, voice bright. Ethan nodded back, managing a polite half-smile. The man continued on without slowing. Music leaking faintly from one earbud. His footsteps faded quickly. The forest reclaimed its silence. Rex stopped again a few minutes later, posture tightening. He lowered his head, sniffed a spot just off the trail where the undergrowth had been pressed down, leaves bent but not broken. Ethan followed his gaze and saw what Rex saw, a set of prints, shallow but distinct, heading away from the main path. Human, recent. The tread pattern was unfamiliar, not hiking boots, maybe work shoes. Ethan felt a small pull of concern, the old reflex that wanted to catalog, assess, report. He reminded himself he wasn't on duty. He was just passing through. Still, Rex's interest didn't fade. He whined once, low and questioning, then looked back at Ethan. The dog wasn't alarmed. He was curious. Ethan hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Just a look," he murmured. He adjusted his grip on the leash and stepped off the trail. The ground changed immediately. Without the compacted path, each step sank slightly into loam and needles. The air grew stiller, thicker. Rex moved with care, nose close to the earth, tail level. They followed the disturbance for only a short distance before it disappeared into undisturbed growth. Whatever had passed through hadn't lingered. Ethan exhaled, tension easing. He guided Rex back toward the trail. That was when they heard it, a sharp crack, distant but unmistakable. Wood splitting, not a branch falling under its own weight, but something under pressure. Rex froze, ears high, body angled toward the sound. Ethan's pulse kicked. He scanned the trees, the spaces between trunks where shadow pooled. Another sound followed, softer this time, like metal shifting against wood. They waited. Nothing else moved. No voices, no footsteps, just the forest breathing around them, patient and unreadable. Ethan felt the edge of something old stir inside him, the awareness that had once kept him alive in places where waiting too long meant never leaving. He didn't panic. He listened. Rex tugged gently on the leash, not forward, not back, but to the right, toward a section of forest that looked darker despite the sun. Ethan frowned. This wasn't the direction of the trail. He considered ignoring the cue. Then the crack came again, closer now, followed by a low groan, as if something heavy had shifted and settled unwillingly into place. Ethan weighed his options. The rational part of him knew better than to wander off marked paths. The part shaped by years of responding to the wrong sound at the wrong time told him that sometimes the safest thing was to understand what you were hearing before it found you. He tightened the leash slightly, not to restrain Rex, but to signal readiness. "Slow," he whispered. They moved cautiously, stepping around fallen logs and thick roots. The ground sloped downward, leading them into a shallow ravine where the air felt cooler and damper. Sunlight thinned to narrow shafts. The smell changed, less green, more old wood and rust. Ethan recognized it before he saw it, the scent of abandoned work. The structure emerged gradually, revealed in pieces rather than all at once. First, a length of timber jutting at an unnatural angle. Then, a wall, gray with age, its surface scarred by weather and time. Finally, the outline of a roof, low and uneven, partially collapsed at one corner, but still holding. It wasn't a cabin. It was something larger, broader, built for purpose rather than comfort. An old logging outbuilding stood at the bottom of the ravine, half swallowed by summer growth. Moss crept up its sides, blackberry vines tangled around its base, their leaves glossy and sharp. A rusted pulley hung from a beam near the entrance, rope long since rotted away. The door, if it had ever had one, was gone, leaving a dark rectangle that swallowed light. Rex stopped at the edge of the clearing, stance alert but controlled. His ears flicked, catching something Ethan couldn't hear. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply watched, muscles ready, eyes bright. Ethan felt a prickle along his arms. The place wasn't threatening, exactly, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that came from being forgotten rather than destroyed. Ethan took a step forward, then another, careful not to make sudden noise. Heat pressed down on his shoulders, but the air near the structure was cooler, shaded, and damp. The crack they'd heard came again, closer still, followed by a metallic clatter that echoed briefly, then died. "Hello?" Ethan called, voice steady. He didn't expect an answer. None came. The forest remained indifferent. Rex shifted, glancing back at Ethan, then toward the opening. He was asking, not insisting. Ethan nodded once. They approached together. Just inside the threshold, the ground was littered with debris, splintered wood, old nails, flakes of rust. Sunlight cut across the interior in narrow bands, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily. Toward the back, something moved, not fast, not hiding, just settling, like a door or beam responding to gravity. Ethan stopped. He took in the details, the angles, the silence between sounds. He didn't know yet what this place was or why Rex had brought him here. He only knew that whatever waited inside was part of the forest's story, not a random interruption. Behind him, the cicadas resumed their chorus, loud and insistent, as if urging the moment forward. Ethan squared his shoulders, one hand resting lightly on Rex's harness. Summer pressed in from all sides, hot, alive, relentless. He stepped inside. Inside the outbuilding, the temperature dropped by several degrees, the relief immediate but uneasy. The shade felt earned rather than generous, a pocket of cool air held together by thick timbers and neglect. Ethan paused just past the threshold, letting his eyes adjust. The smell was unmistakable now. Old grease, damp wood, rust, and something faintly sweet that suggested sap hardened long ago. Light slid in through gaps in the warped roof, tracing thin, slanted lines across the floor where dust and pollen floated like lazy sparks. Rex entered without hesitation, paws placing carefully among nails and splinters. His body language shifted from alert to investigative. Head low, tail steady, ears swiveling to catalog the room. He was working now, not wandering. Ethan felt the subtle change through the leash, a familiar transfer of purpose that steadied his own breathing. The outbuilding had once been a small logging shed, built sturdy and practical. Heavy beams framed the space, their edges softened by time. Against the left wall stood the remains of a workbench, its surface scarred by saw marks and oil stains. A row of hooks held nothing now, but the outlines of old tools were etched into the wood like ghosts. Near the back, a length of chain lay coiled beside a rusted hand winch, its handle bent and half buried in debris. That was the source of the sound. The metal had shifted when the building settled, protesting its own age. Ethan moved slowly, boots crunching softly. He resisted the urge to touch everything at once. In places like this, patience mattered. Rex stopped near the center of the room and sniffed intently at the floor. Then, at a low partition that divided the shed into two sections, he whined once, quiet and controlled, and glanced back at Ethan. This time, there was something different in his eyes. Not curiosity, concern. "Show me," Ethan said. Rex slipped around the partition and disappeared briefly from view. Ethan followed, heart rate ticking upward in a measured way. The back section was smaller, darker. A single window, half obscured by vines, let in a narrow blade of light. Beneath it lay a shape that didn't belong. It was a horse. The animal lay on its side, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. A bay mare, maybe 12 or 13 years old, her coat dulled by sweat and dirt, flanks heaving. One hind leg was trapped beneath a fallen beam, the wood pressing awkwardly against muscle rather than bone. Her mane, usually kept neat judging by the trimmed length, was tangled and matted. One eye was open, wide and glassy with pain, rolling slightly as Ethan stepped closer. Ethan froze. He hadn't expected this. His first instinct was to back away, to give the animal space, but Rex moved in with calm authority, positioning himself near the mare's head without touching her. He lowered his body, making himself smaller, non-threatening. The horse's breathing stuttered, then steadied just a fraction. "Easy," Ethan murmured, voice low. He crouched, hands visible, movements deliberate. He knew horses well enough to know he didn't know them at all. Large prey animals, strength wrapped around fear. One wrong move could turn panic into disaster. The mare's tack told a partial story. A worn leather halter hung loose around her neck, rope lead snapped clean. The leather was old but cared for, oiled and flexible. Someone had been here recently, someone who had lost control or been forced to let go. Rex glanced at Ethan, then back at the mare, as if waiting for instruction. Ethan scanned the beam pinning her leg. It wasn't crushing. It had fallen at an angle and lodged against another support. That was good news. It meant the leg might be freeable without catastrophic damage. It also meant that moving it carelessly could shift the entire structure. Ethan exhaled slowly and took stock. He wasn't a veterinarian. He wasn't a ranger on duty. But he had spent years assessing unstable environments under pressure. The principles were the same. Don't rush, control variables, keep everyone, human and animal, alive first. "Rex, stay," he said quietly. Rex obeyed immediately, settling near the mare's head, presence calm and anchoring. The dog's amber eyes never left her face. Ethan moved toward the beam, testing it with his foot. It was heavy but not immovable. He traced its length, noting where it wedged into the floor and where it pressed against the horse. He spotted a crowbar leaning against the far wall, its handle splintered but intact. Someone had left it there on purpose, or someone had planned to come back. As he lifted the crowbar, Ethan noticed movement outside the window, a shadow passing, then stopping. A voice followed, tight with strain. "Easy, Willow. Easy, girl." Ethan turned toward the sound. A man appeared in the doorway, breathing hard, hat clutched in his hands. He was in his late 50s, tall but stooped slightly, with a weathered face etched by sun and wind. His beard was gray and thick, trimmed short, framing a mouth that looked used to giving firm instructions. He wore a faded denim shirt darkened with sweat and dirt, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms corded with muscle that age hadn't softened so much as refined. His eyes were a pale blue, sharp despite the panic flickering behind them. He took in the scene in a heartbeat, the horse, the beam, Rex, Ethan, and swallowed. "Thank God," he said, voice rough. "I thought—" He didn't finish the sentence. "I'm Ethan," Ethan said. "Your horse?" The man nodded, stepping in carefully. "Caleb Morris. She's mine, Willow." He moved as if drawn by instinct toward the mare, then stopped short when she shifted, a small, painful sound escaping her. He clenched his jaw, visibly forcing himself to stay back. She spooked when the beam cracked, pulled free and bolted. I followed the sound, but he gestured helplessly at the structure. Didn't want to rush her and make it worse. Ethan nodded. The restraint told him what he needed to know about Caleb. This was a man used to responsibility, to choosing patience over panic. "You did right," Ethan said. "Her legs pinned, but not crushed. We can try to lift the beam, slow." Caleb exhaled, some of the tension bleeding from his shoulders. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dirt. "Tell me what you need." They worked in quiet coordination. Ethan positioned the crowbar, testing leverage points, careful not to jar the structure. Caleb braced another support, muscles straining as he held weight that wanted to slip. Rex remained by Willow's head, steady as a stone, his presence doing more to keep her calm than any words could. "Easy, girl," Caleb murmured, voice softening when he spoke to the horse. The edges of his sternness fell away, revealing a gentler core. Willow's breathing slowed, her eye less wild now, focused on the familiar sound. Ethan counted under his breath. On 3. 1, 2. They lifted together, just enough to slide the beam free of Willow's leg. The mare flinched, then pulled her leg back with a sharp jerk. For a moment, Ethan feared she would thrash, but Rex shifted slightly, blocking her movement without touching, and Caleb spoke her name again, grounding her. The beam fell with a dull thud. Willow lay still, breathing hard but unpinned. They waited. Seconds stretched. Then Willow gathered herself and with a groan of effort, rolled onto her chest and pushed up. She stood shakily, weight tentative on the freed leg, but standing. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Caleb sagged against the wall, eyes closing briefly. When he opened them again, they were wet. He laughed once, short and incredulous. "Stubborn as ever," he said, voice breaking, "just like her owner." Ethan managed a small smile. Rex wagged his tail once, restrained but unmistakably pleased. Outside, the cicadas swelled again, summer reclaiming the moment. Sunlight pushed through the window, catching dust and sweat and the sheen on Willow's coat. The crisis had passed, but the weight of it lingered, heavy and real. Caleb straightened and offered Ethan his hand. His grip was firm, calloused. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "If you hadn't been here—" Ethan shook his head. "We were just passing through." Caleb looked at Rex, then back at Ethan, a knowing expression crossing his face. "Passing through tends to find trouble," he said quietly. "And sometimes it finds something else." Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure yet what this encounter meant, only that the forest had offered him a test, and for the first time in a long while, he hadn't failed it. They led Willow slowly out of the shed, back into the bright, unrelenting summer light. The path ahead remained uncertain, but something in Ethan's chest felt different, loosened, if only slightly, by the simple fact of having helped another living thing stand again. The clearing outside the logging shed felt brighter than it had moments before, as if the forest itself had loosened its grip now that the immediate danger had passed. Summer sunlight spilled down the ravine walls in broken sheets, catching on leaves and turning sweat on skin into a thin, reflective sheen. Willow stood with her head lowered, weight still tentative but no longer collapsing inward. Her breathing had evened out, the sharp panic replaced by a cautious, enduring calm. Rex stayed close to her shoulder, posture relaxed yet ready, a quiet sentinel who understood when to step back and when to remain. Caleb Morris led Willow a few steps farther into the open, giving her space to find her balance. Up close, the years showed on him more clearly. His shoulders were still broad, but time had carved a slight forward tilt into his posture, the stance of a man accustomed to long hours of physical labor and longer years of carrying responsibility alone. His hands were large, knuckles thickened and scarred, nails short and clean, the kind of hands that fixed fences, lifted fallen beams, and held reins steady in bad weather. When he touched Willow's neck, his movements were firm but gentle, practiced enough to reassure without coddling. "She's tougher than she looks," Caleb said, more to Willow than to Ethan. His voice carried the gravelly warmth of someone who didn't waste words but chose them carefully when he did. "Aren't you, girl?" Willow flicked an ear in response and shifted her weight again. The injured leg held. Caleb let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting in his chest for a long time. Ethan watched the interaction quietly. He had seen this kind of bond before, not with horses but with people and dogs under pressure. Trust forged by repetition, not sentiment. He recognized it because it felt familiar in a way most things no longer did. Rex returned to Ethan's side once it was clear Willow wasn't going to bolt. He sat, tongue lolling slightly, chest rising and falling in an easy rhythm. Up close, the dog's coat showed flecks of dust and pollen caught along the darker fur of his back, a reminder that summer left its mark even in moments of stillness. Ethan reached down and rested his hand briefly on Rex's head. The contact grounded them both. Caleb turned then, really looking at Ethan for the first time without the filter of crisis. His pale blue eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but assessment. "You handle yourself like someone who's been in tight places," he said. It wasn't a question. Ethan shrugged, the movement small. "I've had some practice." Caleb nodded as if that confirmed something he'd already guessed. "Name's Caleb," he said again, this time offering it like an introduction instead of an explanation. "I've got a small spread east of here. Horses, a few goats, nothing fancy. Been working these woods most of my life." Ethan introduced himself. He didn't offer details beyond his name. He rarely did anymore. People tended to hear what they wanted regardless. They began moving uphill, away from the ravine. Caleb led, guiding Willow with slow patience, stopping often to let her test her leg. Ethan followed with Rex, eyes scanning the terrain automatically. The forest shifted as they climbed, less damp, more open. Sunlight pooling on patches of ground where fallen trees had left gaps in the canopy. The air buzzed with insects, heat pressing back in now that the shade of the ravine was behind them. "You weren't wrong to follow the sound," Caleb said after a while. "The shed's been unstable for years. I've been meaning to tear it down proper, but every time I come out here, something else needs fixing first." "Why keep it at all?" Ethan asked. Caleb huffed a short laugh. "History, I suppose. That place was part of an old logging operation back when this whole area was rougher than people remember. My father worked there when he was young, said it wasn't kind work, but it kept food on the table. When he passed, I couldn't bring myself to knock it down." There was something in the way he said it that caught Ethan's attention. Not regret exactly. More like an unresolved agreement with the past. They reached a narrow service path, barely more than a suggestion between trees. Caleb stopped and tied Willow's lead loosely to a sturdy trunk so she could rest. He crouched to inspect her leg more closely, fingers probing with care. Willow flinched once, then held still. "No swelling yet," he muttered. "That's a blessing." From this vantage point, the forest stretched out in layered greens and browns, the distant slopes hazy in the summer heat. Somewhere far off, a bird cried out sharply, then fell silent. Ethan felt the familiar pull of vigilance ease slightly. This wasn't a hostile place. It was simply indifferent, and indifference he could work with. "Where were you headed?" Caleb asked, straightening. Ethan hesitated. "Nowhere in particular." Caleb studied him again, this time with something softer in his expression. "That's usually how folks get into trouble out here," he said. "Not because they're careless, but because they think the woods will mind its manners." Ethan almost smiled. "I've got water in a shaded pen not far from here," Caleb continued. "You and your dog are welcome to come by. Let Willow rest. Make sure she's steady before I take her the rest of the way home. Least I can do." The offer was straightforward, without obligation or expectation. Ethan considered it. Part of him wanted to decline, to return to his original plan of quiet distance. Another part, the part that had followed Rex into the ravine, recognized that this was how the forest worked. You didn't take without giving. You didn't pass through without leaving some trace. "All right," he said finally. They walked together along the service path. The terrain grew more familiar, shaped subtly by human hands, old fence posts half rotted into the ground, a length of wire tangled with ivy, the faint smell of smoke carried on a breeze that suggested habitation nearby. After 10 minutes, the trees thinned and opened onto a small clearing where a weathered barn stood, its red paint faded to a soft, tired pink. A corral stretched beside it, rails worn smooth by years of use. A woman emerged from the barn as they approached. She was in her early 40s, medium height, with sun-browned skin and dark hair pulled back into a low, practical knot. Her build was solid, not heavy, shaped by work rather than design. She wore a plain gray shirt and jeans, sleeves rolled, boots scuffed. Her eyes, dark and observant, went immediately to Willow, then to Caleb's face. "Jesus, Caleb," she said, crossing the distance quickly. "What happened?" "Beam gave way," Caleb replied. "She's shaken, but she's standing." The woman exhaled sharply, relief softening her features. She reached Willow's side, hands steady as she checked the mare's flank. "I'm Nora," she said to Ethan, offering a brief nod. Her voice was calm, efficient. "I help keep things running around here." Ethan introduced himself again, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of being seen as more than a passerby. They settled Willow into a shaded pen with fresh water. The mare drank slowly, then rested her head against the rail, eyes half closed. Rex lay nearby, watching her with quiet interest. The crisis had narrowed into something manageable, contained. Caleb leaned against the fence, arms crossed, studying Ethan and Rex together. "You know," he said, "people like to think summer's the easy season, but I've lost more animals to heat and sudden storms than I ever did to winter." Ethan nodded. Summer hid its dangers better. As the afternoon wore on, the heat softened into something more bearable. Cicadas droned, steady and insistent. For the first time since leaving Seattle, Ethan felt the pull to stay rather than move on immediately. Not because he owed anyone anything, but because the moment allowed it. He didn't know yet that this place, this small pocket of forest and weathered buildings, would become more than a pause. Only that the woods had introduced him to someone who understood them, and in doing so, had nudged him one step farther from running and one step closer to standing still on purpose. By late afternoon, the heat had settled into the farm the way dust settled after a truck passed, quietly, insistently, coating everything. The barn's tin roof radiated warmth in slow waves, and the cicadas seemed to lean into their chorus, louder now that the immediate drama had passed. Willow stood in the shade of the pen, one hind leg cocked as she rested it, breathing calm and steady. Her bay coat had darkened where sweat dried unevenly, and her ears flicked at flies with practiced patience. Rex lay on his belly just beyond the rail, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but attentive, as if he were standing guard even while pretending to nap. Ethan took a seat on an overturned feed bucket near the fence, forearms resting on his knees. The position felt familiar, the posture of waiting without expectation. Nora moved between the barn and the pen with efficient steps, setting out water, checking latches, her presence more rhythm than interruption. Up close, Ethan noticed the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the kind earned by sun and squinting into distance rather than age alone. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that steadiness mattered more than force. Caleb returned from the house with a pitcher of water and 3 dented metal cups. He poured without ceremony, passing one to Ethan before taking a long drink himself. "Heat like this makes people sloppy," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Animals, too. They push when they should rest." Ethan nodded. He took a sip, the water cool and grounding. "Where I come from," he said after a moment, "people underestimate summer. They think danger wears a uniform or a season." Caleb gave a short, knowing grunt. "My father used to say winter kills you fast if you're stupid. Summer takes its time." They stood there a while, watching Willow shift her weight and Rex adjust his position in response. The small motions felt important, a language spoken without words. Ethan felt the tension in his shoulders ease, just a fraction. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding himself until the grip loosened. Nora broke the quiet. "You planning to head back before dark?" she asked Ethan, tone neutral, not prying. Ethan glanced toward the tree line where the sun was beginning its slow descent. Shadows lengthened, the forest edge turning dense and dark again. The idea of retracing the trail alone, of stepping back into the same silence that had pushed him forward earlier, no longer felt as simple as it had that morning. "I hadn't decided," he said honestly. Caleb studied him for a beat, then nodded. "You're welcome to stay the night. Got a spare room. It's nothing fancy, but it's cool and it's quiet. Trails change character after sunset in this heat." The offer was made the same way the water had been poured, without pressure, without expectation. Ethan waited. He had intended this trip to be temporary, a few hours stolen from a life he didn't know how to re-enter. Staying felt like crossing a line he hadn't planned to approach. And yet, something about the farm, the honest work, the animals breathing steadily through the heat, felt less like intrusion and more like invitation. "All right," he said. The word felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than agreement. Caleb smiled, brief and understated. "Good." They ate dinner as the light softened, a simple meal of grilled vegetables, bread, and beans that tasted better than it had any right to. Conversation stayed easy, anchored in the practical. Weather patterns, trail conditions, the quirks of animals who had minds of their own. When Ethan spoke, he kept his sentences spare, offering details without opening doors he wasn't ready to walk through. Neither Caleb nor Nora pushed. They listened in the way people did when they understood that silence had weight too. As dusk settled, the temperature dipped just enough to be noticeable. The cicadas gave way to crickets, their sound lighter, more measured. Ethan took Rex for a short walk along the fence line, the dog moving at his side with relaxed precision. Fireflies blinked into existence near the grass, brief points of light rising and falling. Rex watched them with mild interest, head tilting once before dismissing them as irrelevant. When they returned, Caleb was securing the barn for the night. "Room's ready," he said. "Bathroom's down the hall. If you need anything, door's usually unlocked." Ethan thanked him, the words feeling insufficient but sincere. Inside the house, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of soap and old wood. The spare room was small but clean, a narrow bed, a dresser, a window crack to let in night air. Ethan set his pack down and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The sounds of the farm filtered through the walls, an animal shifting, the creak of wood cooling, the steady hum of insects outside. Rex circled once before lying down near the door, positioning himself with his head toward the hallway. Ethan noticed, as he always did, the way the dog chose angles, how even rest was tactical. He lay back staring at the ceiling and felt the day replay in fragments, the ravine, the beam, Willow's labored breathing, the moment she stood. The images didn't hurt the way memories usually did. They simply existed, part of a sequence that made sense. Sleep came slowly but without resistance. When Ethan woke, it was to the low murmur of voices outside and the pale gray of early morning pressing at the window. Rex lifted his head, ears twitching, then relaxed when he recognized the sounds. Ethan rose, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The air was cooler now, washed clean by night. A thin mist clung to the low ground, blurring the edges of the pasture. Nora stood near the pen with another woman Ethan hadn't seen before. She was in her early 30s, tall and athletic, with light brown skin and dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail. She wore a ranger's uniform, the fabric creased and practical, boots mud-scarred. Her posture was alert, balanced, as if she were always half a step from motion. A pair of clear, focused eyes took in Willow, then the pen, then Ethan. "That's her," Nora was saying. "Leg looks better this morning." The woman nodded. "Good." She turned to Ethan. "I'm Rachel Hayes," she said, offering a hand. Her grip was firm, professional. "Forest Service. Caleb called it in last night. Said there was an incident near the old logging shed." Ethan felt a familiar tightening, the reflexive awareness that came with uniforms and reports. He kept his voice even. "We found her pinned, managed to get the beam off." Rachel studied him with interest, gaze sharp but not unkind. "You have training?" "Some," Ethan said. She glanced at Rex, who stood calmly at Ethan's side, tail still. "And the dog?" Ethan's hand rested briefly on Rex's harness. "He's K9, retired." Rachel's eyebrows lifted a fraction. They don't really retire, she said. It wasn't a challenge. It was an observation. Caleb joined them, coffee mug in hand. I figured it was best to loop you in, he said to Rachel. That structure's been a hazard for a while. I'll take responsibility, but… Rachel raised a hand. We'll assess it, she said. Make sure it's secured or marked. Last thing we need is someone else wandering in there. She turned back to Ethan. I'd like to hear your account when you have time. Ethan nodded. He didn't feel cornered. He felt included, which surprised him. As the sun climbed, burning off the mist, the farm stirred fully awake. Willow drank, then took a few careful steps, stronger already. Rex watched her, then looked back at Ethan, ears forward. There was a question in that look, one Ethan recognized from long ago. What next? Ethan didn't know the answer yet, but for the first time in months, the question didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an opening. By mid-morning, the heat had returned, not with the blunt force of the previous day, but with a steady insistence that pressed against skin and patience alike. Sunlight washed the farm in pale gold, glinting off the fence rails and warming the packed earth of the corral. Willow stood more comfortably now, shifting her weight with greater confidence, the stiffness in her injured leg easing into something manageable. Rex watched her from the shade of a cottonwood, ears relaxed, posture loose. The crisis had moved from urgent to watchful, and the farm settled into the quiet labor of recovery. Rachel Hayes walked the perimeter with a small notebook in hand, pausing to take photos and mark locations on a printed map. Up close, Ethan noticed the faint scar along her left forearm, thin and pale. The kind that spoke of an old mishap rather than recent danger. She carried herself with the calm efficiency of someone used to being responsible for outcomes, not just intentions. When she stopped beside Ethan, she didn't look at him immediately. She looked at the land. That shed sits right on an old spur trail, she said. Not maintained, but people wander. We'll need to flag it. Maybe close the approach until we can assess removal. Ethan nodded. It shifted when the beam cracked. Could go again. That's what worries me. Rachel finally turned to him. Her eyes were clear, steady. Caleb mentioned you followed a sound off the main trail. I did. You didn't have to. No, Ethan agreed. But I'm glad I did. She studied him for a moment, weighing something unseen. You weren't reckless, she said at last. You were methodical. That's not common. Ethan felt the familiar urge to deflect praise, to shrink away from attention. He resisted it. It's training, he said simply. Rachel nodded, accepting the answer without pressing. She closed her notebook. There's something else, she said. A reason I'm out here besides the report. Ethan waited. Rex lifted his head, sensing the shift in tone. We've had 2 near misses this week, Rachel continued. Hikers pushing deeper than they should because the weather looks friendly. One family turned around in time. Another pair didn't. She paused, choosing her words carefully. They're overdue, not lost exactly, but not where they're supposed to be. Ethan's chest tightened, the old reflex rising without invitation. Search and rescue, Rachel nodded. We've got teams staged. Yeah, but the terrain's tricky in this heat. Dogs would help. Her gaze flicked to Rex, then back to Ethan. I know he's retired, and I know asking puts you on the spot. I wouldn't ask if we had better options. The farm seemed to hold its breath. Cicadas droned, relentless. Caleb stood a short distance away, hands on hips, pretending not to listen while missing nothing. Nora leaned against the barn door, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in thought. Ethan looked down at Rex. The dog met his gaze, tail still, eyes intent. There was no hesitation there, no question, only readiness. I can help, Ethan said. The words surprised him with how easily they came. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you. We'll brief you properly. If at any point you want to step back, I won't, Ethan said, not bravado, certainty. They set out within the hour. Rachel's truck led the way along a narrow service road that climbed toward higher ground, dust rising behind the tires. Ethan followed in Caleb's old pickup, Rex riding in the back seat with practiced calm. The heat intensified as they gained elevation, air thinning, sun unfiltered by canopy. The forest here was younger, the result of regrowth after long-ago logging, trees packed tight and straight, underbrush thick and unforgiving. They parked near a ridge where the ground dropped steeply on one side. A small team waited there, 2 rangers and a volunteer tracker named Miguel Santos, a compact man in his 40s with a shaved head and a sun-darkened face that creased easily into a smile despite the seriousness of the task. His movements were economical, his gear worn but meticulously maintained. He greeted Ethan with a nod, eyes flicking briefly to Rex with professional interest. "Dogs a Malinois?" Miguel asked. "Yes." "Good noses," Miguel said. "And stubborn." Ethan allowed a faint smile. "That's accurate." Rachel outlined the situation quickly. 2 hikers, mid-20s, last seen near a junction that fed into older logging roads. No distress call, but overdue by 12 hours. Heat exhaustion was the primary concern. The plan was simple. Split coverage, focus on water sources and shaded low ground, where people tended to drift when tired. Ethan clipped Rex's harness on, fingers moving from muscle memory. The weight of it settled something inside him, aligning intention with action. "Find," he said softly. Rex surged forward, nose low, tail steady, the leash slack as he worked. The world narrowed to scent and sign. Ethan followed, senses sharpened, awareness expanding outward instead of collapsing inward the way it had for months. They moved through brush and over uneven ground, the heat pressing in waves. Sweat darkened Ethan's shirt, trickling down his spine. Rex panted lightly but never slowed. At a dry creek bed, he paused, circled once, then veered sharply left. Ethan felt the confirmation ripple through him. This wasn't wandering. This was purpose. They found the first sign an hour later, a discarded water bottle, crushed and warm to the touch, wedged beneath a fern. Miguel crouched beside it, nodding. "That's ours," he said. "Brand matches what they were carrying." Rex pulled again, urgency building. The terrain steepened, forcing careful footing. At the bottom of a shallow gully, they heard it, a faint voice, hoarse and strained. "Hello?" Rachel answered immediately, voice carrying. "Forest Service, stay where you are." They found the hikers moments later. A man and a woman sat slumped against a fallen log, faces flushed, eyes unfocused. The woman's hands trembled as she lifted them in a weak wave. Both were dehydrated, exhausted, but conscious. Relief hit Ethan like a physical thing, sharp and grounding. Rex approached them slowly, posture calm, letting them see him. The woman let out a shaky laugh. "Is that a police dog?" "Close enough," Ethan said, kneeling. He handed over water, coached them through slow sips, monitored their breathing. The training flowed through him without effort, each step familiar and precise. As the rangers took over, Ethan stepped back, giving space. Rex returned to his side, tail wagging once, restrained but unmistakably pleased. Rachel met Ethan's gaze across the clearing, gratitude clear and unguarded. "Good work," she said. Ethan nodded. The praise landed differently this time. It didn't sting. It didn't slide off. It settled. They hiked out as the afternoon wore on, heat easing slightly as clouds gathered far off. Back at the vehicles, Rachel handed Ethan a card. "If you're willing," she said, "we could use you, officially or not. There's a need." Ethan took the card, feeling its weight. He looked at Rex, then back at the forest stretching out beyond the ridge. For the first time since Seattle, the idea of staying, of choosing to be where he was, felt less like surrender and more like direction. "I'll think about it," he said. Rachel smiled, small but sincere. "That's all I ask." As they drove back toward the farm, dust trailing behind them, Ethan felt the quiet settle in his chest again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was steady, useful. The summer heat still pressed down, relentless as ever, but it no longer felt like something he had to endure alone. The evening returned with a different kind of heat, the sort that lingered in the bones after the sun slipped behind the ridgeline. Back at the farm, the air felt thicker, weighted by the day's exertion and the faint promise of weather turning somewhere far beyond the hills. Ethan parked the truck and sat for a moment before getting out, hands resting on the wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Rex watched him from the back seat, head tilted slightly, eyes steady. The look wasn't urgent. It was patient. They stepped out together. The farm had settled into its end-of-day rhythm. Animals fed, gates checked, tools put away. Willow stood at the far end of the pen, her stance noticeably stronger now, head up, ears alert. She took a few careful steps, testing the leg she'd injured, then paused, satisfied. Caleb watched from the fence, arms folded, relief etched into the lines of his face. "She'll be sore," he said when Ethan approached, "but she'll mend. Horses are like that, breakable and stubborn at the same time." Ethan nodded. "So are people." Caleb snorted softly, conceding the point. "You did good today, both of you." His gaze dropped briefly to Rex, who accepted the attention with a single wag of his tail. Forrest has a way of pulling out what folks are still carrying. Ethan felt the truth of that settle. The rescue had left him tired in a clean way, muscles sore, mind quieter. It was different from the exhaustion that came from fighting memories. This was earned fatigue, useful. After a simple dinner, cooler food this time, sliced tomatoes, cheese, bread, the sky darkened unevenly, clouds stacking low and heavy. The cicadas went silent all at once, replaced by the distant roll of thunder. Nora glanced up from the sink, drying her hands on a towel. "That's not nothing," she said. "Storm's moving faster than forecast." Rachel's truck pulled into the drive as the first wind swept across the pasture, bending grass flat in rippling waves. She stepped out, jacket already on, hair pulled tight, posture alert. "We've got a call," she said without preamble. "Lightning strike near the upper switchbacks. Single hiker. Radio contact was weak." Ethan felt the old focus snap into place. "When?" 10 minutes ago, then nothing." Rachel looked at Rex, then back at Ethan. "I know you've already put in hours today. I won't fault you if—" "I'm in," Ethan said. There was no hesitation now. The words came from a place that felt aligned rather than compelled. They moved quickly. The drive up was shorter but steeper, the road slickening as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Wind shook the trees hard enough to send leaves skittering across the hood. At the trailhead, the storm hit in earnest, rain slashing down, thunder cracking close enough to rattle teeth. Headlamps cut narrow tunnels through the dark as the team split, voices raised just enough to be heard over the rain. Rex worked immediately, nose down, body low, tail steady despite the weather. Lightning flared, bleaching the forest white for a heartbeat, then plunging it back into darkness. The rain cooled the air abruptly, steam rising from the ground in ghostly swirls. Ethan kept his footing careful, every step deliberate on slick roots and rock. They found the hiker less than half a mile up the switchbacks. A young man in his early 20s, slim build, hair plastered to his forehead, crouched beneath a cedar with his arms wrapped tight around his chest. His skin was pale, lips tinged blue, eyes wide and unfocused. He flinched when the headlamp swept over him, then sagged with visible relief. I heard it hit," he stammered, voice shaking. "The tree, right there." The cedar above him bore a fresh scar, bark split and smoking faintly despite the rain. Rachel moved in with practiced calm, assessing, speaking steadily. Ethan crouched on the other side, keeping his movements slow, grounding the young man with clear instructions. Rex sat close, pressed against Ethan's leg, a solid presence that anchored the moment. They got the hiker moving downhill as the storm intensified, lightning cracking closer now. The rain turned the trail into a slick ribbon, but the adrenaline sharpened focus. By the time they reached the vehicles, the young man was shivering but coherent, wrapped in a dry jacket and sipping warm liquid from a thermos. Back at the farm later that night, the storm rolled overhead, rain drumming on the roof, thunder echoing through the valley. The house felt smaller, tighter, but safe. Ethan sat on the edge of the spare bed, boots off, socks damp. Rex curled nearby. His muscles ached, but his mind was still. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see the lake. He saw the forest lit by lightning, saw a young man's fear ease into relief, saw Rex's steady silhouette in the rain. Sleep came hard and fast. He woke before dawn to silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean. The air was cool, sharp, smelling of wet earth and leaves torn fresh from branches. Outside, mist clung low to the ground, turning the pasture into a pale sea. Ethan stepped out barefoot, coffee mug warming his hands. Rex followed, ears perked, tail low and relaxed. Caleb stood by the fence, already awake, hat pulled low, steam rising from his breath. He nodded in greeting. "Storms like that remind you who's in charge," he said. Ethan took in the quiet, the way sound carried differently after rain. "They remind you you're still part of it," he replied. Rachel joined them a few minutes later, jacket unzipped now, hair damp but controlled. She leaned against the fence, looking out over the land. "I filed the report," she said. "Both rescues. Your name's in it." Ethan felt a flicker of something. Pride, maybe, or recognition. It didn't overwhelm him. It fit. "Thanks." She studied him for a long moment, then spoke carefully. "We're short-handed. Summer brings people who underestimate this place. I won't dress it up. It's hard work. Inconsistent. Sometimes thankless." Her gaze dropped briefly to Rex, then returned. "But you and your dog make a difference, not just in numbers." Ethan thought of Seattle, of the empty house, of days measured only by endurance. He thought of the farm, the forest, the way his skills had found use without demanding he explain himself. He didn't answer immediately. The quiet after a storm felt sacred, not to be rushed. "I'm not looking for a uniform," he said finally. "Or a title." Rachel nodded. "I'm looking for people who show up." Ethan looked down at Rex. The dog met his gaze, eyes bright, tail giving a single confident wag. There was no question there. Only readiness. "All right," Ethan said. "I'll stay. For the season." The words settled into the morning like a promise. Not dramatic, not grand, but solid. The forest remained what it had always been. Indifferent, demanding, alive. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt himself standing within it rather than passing through, not waiting for the quiet to end, but ready to listen to what came next. The weeks that followed folded into one another with the quiet inevitability of work well done. Summer tightened its grip on the forest, days stretching long and bright, nights cooling just enough to let sleep come without struggle. Ethan fell into a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed. Mornings began before the sun crested the ridgeline, coffee steaming in the cool air while mist still clung to the low ground. Rex woke with him every time, rising from his bed by the door without a sound, ready before the leash ever came out. The dog's coat had lightened slightly under the sun, a dusting of summer along his shoulders, but his focus never wavered. Rachel kept her word. There was no uniform pressed into Ethan's hands, no badge to weigh down his pocket. Instead, there were briefings under open sky, maps spread across tailgates, and radios crackling with voices that learned his name quickly. She ran her teams with a steady clarity that made room for competence without turning it into theater. Up close, Ethan saw the way responsibility had shaped her, how she listened first, how she spoke plainly, how she trusted expertise without surrendering oversight. When she asked for input, it wasn't to test him, it was because she meant to use it. The calls came steadily. Lost hikers who mistook heat for friendliness, families pushing farther than their water allowed, climbers surprised by weather that moved faster than forecasts. Ethan and Rex worked the edges, trailheads at dawn, switchbacks at dusk, creek beds and shaded gullies where people drifted when exhaustion set in. The work demanded attention, patience, and the willingness to stop short of heroics. Rex thrived in it, tail low and steady, nose telling stories Ethan had learned to read like a language he hadn't known he missed. At the farm, life continued in parallel. Willow's leg healed cleanly. She returned to full-weight bearing within days, and soon enough she was trotting the fence line again, mane lifting in the breeze, energy contained but unmistakable. Caleb watched her with a quiet satisfaction that didn't need to announce itself. He was a man shaped by endurance, his kindness expressed through maintenance rather than declarations. When he spoke about the land, he did so with a respect that bordered on reverence, as if every fence post and worn rail carried a memory worth preserving. Nora proved to be the kind of presence that made systems work without ever stepping into the spotlight. She organized feed schedules, coordinated volunteers who came and went with Summer, and kept a running ledger of small fixes that prevented larger problems. When Ethan asked once how she'd learned to manage so many moving parts, she shrugged. "You learn by staying," she said. It wasn't advice, it was fact. One afternoon brought a different kind of task. A group of local teenagers had been assigned to help clear brush near an old access road, part of a prevention effort to reduce fire risk. They arrived loud and uncertain, long limbs and half-formed confidence, glancing often at their phones until Rachel laid out expectations with calm authority. Ethan was asked to supervise one crew. He hadn't worked with kids in years. The thought made something tighten in his chest. They were good kids mostly, sunburned, restless, earnest beneath the noise. One boy in particular stood apart, tall and angular, hair falling into his eyes no matter how often he pushed it back. His name was Lucas, 16, shoulders slumped in a way that suggested he'd learned early to make himself smaller. When Rex approached, Lucas stiffened, then relaxed when the dog sat politely, head tilted in curiosity. "He won't bite," Ethan said gently. Lucas nodded, a smile flickering. "I know," he said. "I used to help train dogs. Before." Before what? Ethan didn't ask. He handed Lucas a pair of gloves and set him to work, trimming back blackberry vines along the fence. As the afternoon wore on, Lucas grew steadier, more confident, asking questions about Rex's training, about the forest, about how you learned to read ground the way Ethan did. Ethan answered honestly, without polish. By the end of the day, Lucas stood taller, sweat streaking his face, pride visible and unguarded. When he thanked Ethan, it was quiet and sincere. The sound stayed with Ethan longer than he expected. The season edged forward. Fires flared in distant regions, smoke tinting the sky a faint orange on certain mornings, a reminder of how quickly summer could turn. Teams adapted, routes shifted. Ethan found himself anticipating needs before they were spoken, stepping into gaps without announcement. He noticed the change not because anyone pointed it out, but because his nights were no longer filled with restless pacing. Sleep came and stayed. On a clear evening near the end of August, Rachel called a meeting at the ridge overlook. The sun dipped low, washing the valley in gold. Crews gathered, tired and dusty, leaning against trucks, passing water bottles. Rachel spoke briefly, thanking them for a season without serious loss. She mentioned names, Caleb's, Nora's, Miguel's, Ethan's, without flourish. When she finished, there was no applause, just a shared exhale. It was enough. Later, as people drifted away, Rachel walked with Ethan along the edge of the overlook. "You did good work," she said, "not just in the field." Ethan looked out over the trees, layered and endless. "I did what was needed." She smiled faintly. "That's what I mean." Back at the farm, the first hint of fall crept into the nights. Ethan stood by the fence with Rex at his side, watching Willow graze, listening to crickets start earlier than they had weeks ago. The season was changing. He felt it in his joints, in the way the air cooled faster after sunset, in the quiet acceptance settling into his chest. Caleb joined him, hands in his pockets. "You heading back when the season ends?" he asked, not prying, just marking time. Ethan considered the question carefully. Seattle waited. The house with its empty rooms waited. He could go back now and face it with more than he'd brought with him. That mattered. He didn't answer right away. "I'll go back," he said finally. "But I won't disappear again." Caleb nodded. "Good." Rachel stopped by the next morning with paperwork. Nothing binding, just a standing invitation. "You know where to find us," she said. "Any season." Ethan took the folder, feeling its weight. "I do." The last day of summer came quietly. No drama, no sirens. Just a long morning walk through the trees, Rex moving ahead with relaxed confidence, the forest opening and closing around them in familiar patterns. When they returned, Ethan packed his bag with care, the same way he'd learned to do everything else lately. Intentionally. He stood at the edge of the pasture once more, sun warming his back, and felt something settle into place. He hadn't come here to be found. He'd come to be quiet enough to hear what remained. The forest had answered in work, in trust, in the steady presence of a dog who never asked him to be anything but honest. Rex pressed against his leg, a solid, familiar weight. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's head, fingers threading through warm fur. "Ready," he said softly. Rex's tail wagged once, confident and sure. As Ethan drove away, dust rising behind the truck, the farm shrank into the distance, but it didn't vanish. It stayed with him, a season that had learned his name and given it back to him intact. Summer had not been kind, it had been honest, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a loyal dog, a stranger who shows up at the right moment, or a path you never planned to walk. Maybe God doesn't always remove the storm right away. Maybe he sends shelter instead. A reason to keep going. A reminder that even the broken are still needed. In our daily lives, we all carry unseen weight, fear, loss, loneliness. But if this story teaches us anything, it's this: no one is ever truly forgotten, not by God, not by purpose, not by hope. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a quiet reminder that they are not alone. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you. And if you believe in second chances, in unseen miracles, and in standing for those who cannot stand alone, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless every one of you watching. May He protect your families, guide your steps, and bring light into even the quietest corners of your life. Amen.